This is the Quantum Biology Podcast, where we break down the practical health applications of this emerging science, starting with healthy light habits and going wherever the quantum superhighway takes us. In this episode, Dr. Stephen Hussey turns our ideas about heart health upside down and explains why the conventional wisdom we grew up with is mostly wrong, that the heart isn't just a pump, and how the new quantum biologic paradigm helps us understand what is truly important to preventing heart attacks and keeping our hearts healthy. And it's not what we've been told. You can also check out Dr. Hussey's book on this topic. The link is in the show notes. This is a really important episode. Enjoy. All right. Welcome, Dr. Stephen Hussey. So excited to have you on the podcast. We had a great time listening to your presentation deep dive on the quantum vascular system. It's absolutely incredible. So to start off, let's just start with the heart. I think for most people, we think of what we were all told all our lives, that the heart is a pump and there's certain things to do to keep it healthy. And when I listen to you speak and the other heart specialists who've studied quantum biology, what I hear is actually it's the light that makes the heart work. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, I guess, in a sense of it is the light for sure, because it's the structuring of water. And so, the number one absorbed energy by water is infrared light, which is why it's so important, to get all aspects of light, and why you can think about, like in a hospital setting, how being under this blue light and this non-healing environment, these things that interfere with the structure of water, would be the worst spot for someone to be who's in, say, like heart failure. But yeah, so, when you think about it, and I think the first time I got exposure to this was I read a study that was basically showed how inefficient the heart was if you look at it as a pressure propulsion pump, which is a pump that sucks in water from somewhere, like stagnant water from like a reservoir or something, and then forcefully pumps it somewhere else, like moves it using some sort of energy. And that's just not what the heart does. And like they looked at it and they measured it, like as far as like energy expenditure from heart cells, and it was like 15% efficient if we looked at it that way, which in my mind, whether you think about it as something that was created or something that evolved, like that wouldn't be the best way to make something, at 15% efficiency. So we must be looking at it wrong. Like, St. George said, if nature answers intelligent questions intelligently. So if there's no answer, there's something wrong with the question. So there must be something wrong with our view of the heart. And so, yeah, it actually functions more like a hydraulic ram. And so it's important to understand that, because, I didn't know what a hydraulic ram was when I first came across that term. I had to go look it up and watch a YouTube video. But the importance of that is that a hydraulic ram operates by flow going into the system. So there's already blood flow, which is, if you look at, the heart, like it's interesting that it's placed in the middle of the system. It's between the arteries and the veins. It's between where this flow is happening already. So it makes sense to look at it like a hydraulic ram. And really it's two hydraulic rams kind of stuck together. The right side and the left side make up those hydraulic rams. And so a hydraulic ram is flow activated. So fluid of some sort has to be flowing into it for it to operate efficiently. And there's a few different differences from the hydraulic ram to the heart, which we'll talk about. But basically, so that led me to believe, okay, well then, fluid has to be flowing into it, and so that must mean that the heart is not creating the flow, or at least not the main reason or the only reason or something like that. And so then, eventually I get down the line, I read something like Gerald Pollack's work and many others about how, water can kind of propel itself if you put it in the right system. So if you put it in a system where there's a a hydrophilic or a biological surface. We know that biological surfaces are hydrophilic. And we put water, which the blood is about half water, then it will structure itself onto the lining of the artery, kind of form like this gel-like phase, and that rearranges the charges a little bit so that the structure of water is very electronegative, and the space in the middle, the lumen of the artery, is very positive because of the hydrogen ions that are cleaved off of that. And it creates this battery that does work, that creates fluid flow. And in Pollack's lab, they can put an energy into that system, which infrared light is the most popular one, into that system, and flow will continue in the same direction for as long as that energy is provided. And so there we have an answer, at least, to the main way that fluid is flowing on its own. So fluid's flowing. That's one way that's kind of what kind of gets the fluid flowing, or keeps the blood moving. But then there are other things that.
Before you go on to the other way, so I just want to recap because we have some newer listeners. So when you say hydrophilic surface, you're talking about a surface that the water is attracted to. Would that be a fair way to explain it?
Water-loving surface, yeah. Rather than like a hydrophobic one, which is like, I guess the way to illustrate that is like if you see like a droplet of oil or something in water, it's hydrophobic, so it stays together. It doesn't blend very well. It stays away from that water and to itself. Whereas hydrophilic, water loving, it wants to go to that surface, attracted to it, and that encourages it to do certain, make certain changes in the water and the structure of the water.
Okay, great. Continue. Thanks.
Yeah. So, this battery that's created when that structured water forms is how water or the blood is flowing. But there are other things that also kind of keep it flowing as well. One of them is paramagnetism. So there are things like the tissues in the body, have kind of this magnetism due to the mitochondria. They kind of create this magnetic attraction. And there are things in the blood like iron, like zeta potential on red blood cells, different things like that are attracted to magnets. So it's no coincidence that the heart has the largest magnetic field of anything in the entire body, especially when it comes to the veins, because the veins need the blood in the veins need to be drawn back to the heart through that magnetism. So we have this fourth phase water lining the arteries. We have this magnetic attraction in certain directions. And then people always ask me, well, how does it leave the heart then if the heart's got this magnetic attraction? That's why we have a contracting ventricle. It's one reason why we have a contracting ventricle, because it kind of gives it this push away from the heart, so that it can get away from that magnetic pull. And then once it gets into that circulation, like I said, the fluid is already flowing because of, once it's going in one direction, it's always going to stay in that direction. So once it gets back out into the circulation, then the fourth phase water lining the arteries keeps it moving away from the heart. But then also to a point when it gets away from the heart, at a certain point, it'll start to be attracted to the magnetism of the tissues, which is much weaker magnetism than the heart, but still enough to draw things toward it. So when it gets to a certain point, like maybe the smaller blood vessels and definitely the capillaries, it starts getting drawn toward the tissues because it's closer than the magnetic pull from the heart.
Okay, so I'm just going to check back in for a second. So when we have our sort of out of date notion of the heart as a pump, and the pump does everything, what I'm hearing you say is that there is a pumping mechanism, but it's kind of like just a little springboard to get over that hump of getting the flow to continue away from the magnetism of the heart. It's not the entire action.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's one reason the heart contracts. The other reason is that it vortexes blood, it spirals the blood, which is another way that you can energize water so that when it gets next to a hydrophilic surface, it structures itself. So there are multiple reasons why we have. So how did those things
work together, the vortexing and the magnetic flow that you were just talking about?
Well, the vortexing is just it's a way that, so vortexing in the presence of oxygen, which the blood is always oxygenated, even when it's coming from the veins, like there's still oxygen present. It's less so than when it's after it's been to the lungs in the arterial side, but there's still oxygen present. So when you vortex or spiral or just swish around really water, like when I think of like at a river, when there's rapids, that's energizing water. That white water you see is energizing water. The same kind of thing. There's a mechanism in the body, which is a vortexing heart. So if you look at the muscles of the heart, or the muscle really, because it's one big long muscle that's wrapped up on itself that forms these different chambers. When it contracts in a spiral-like motion. And so that's, vortexing. And so vortexing in the presence of oxygen is one way that they've seen that it energizes water. And so that's the main role of the heart, I think, is to vortex blood. So in a way, it is kind of responsible for the motion of blood, but just not in the forceful pumping that we think of. Because if you look at it, biomechanically, it's impossible for a heart the size of ours to pump blood throughout the entire body. It's just, there's no way it can happen. The physics of it just don't add up. But yeah, so it vortexes it so that it energizes it so that when it gets to the hydrophilic surface, their biological surface anywhere in the body, it can structure itself, which is then creating the flow. And then the magnetism is just what keeps things going in the right direction. And also like concentration gradients of nutrients like oxygen, especially. It's going to be lower in the tissues if the tissues are using up oxygen. So especially when it gets into the capillaries, the blood is drawn by concentration gradient from, blood vessels into tissues, because, the oxygen is higher in the blood and the arteries going into the tissues. So all these different things kind of, keeping blood going in the right direction. And then the concentration gradient, when we exercise, is what drives the increase in blood flow, because the tissues need more oxygen when we're exercising or exerting ourselves. And so that drives more flow of blood, and the heart increasing contractions or increasing beating. It's just trying to keep up with the increase in flow. Like it'd be easy to say, oh, the increase in heartbeat is what's driving more, quicker blood flow. But in reality, the blood flow quickens because of the increase in concentration gradient. And then the heart has to keep up with that. So it starts beating faster, contracting faster. And they've shown that. So
it's the other way around. The heart doesn't pump faster to speed up the blood. The blood starts to flow faster. So the increased oxygen, and then the heart has to keep up with it to do its job of vortexing and moving it through.
Yeah. And they've actually shown that on really, really high exertion, that the valves of the heart almost just stay open, and the blood's just moving through, which is why you can't do that very long, because it's not vortexing at that point. But the blood's moving so fast that the heart really can't keep up with it. So it's almost like the valves are just open and they're just allowing blood to flow through, because the tissue demand is so great at that point.
So what would be some examples of that would put a heart in that state? Like very, very intense exercise? Could it also be intense stress? And does that lead to problems if you force your heart to stay like that for a long period of time?
I think so. Yeah. So maybe prolonged intense stress. Yeah. Like in a momentary acute stress where you react to it and then you ideally go back to homeostasis. Wouldn't necessarily do that. But yeah, it's one, like, I guess like sprinting or, overexerting yourself for a long period of time. So I think of endurance athletes, which I'm not a huge fan of endurance sports in general, for different reasons. But yeah, that would be a case, where if you're running that hard, that long, that, yeah, you're interfering with flow at that point, because you're not creating vortex. And there are other places in the, like moving through the heart, that blood gets vortexed. But if it's not contracting and the blood's moving through so fast that it can't get a hold of it and spiral it, then that's going to create flow issues, which is why at some point you can't do that type of exercise anymore. Your body just kind of shuts down, because it's not getting the concentration gradient demand for nutrition. It's not being created, because the blood flow is suffering because it's not able to contract or not able to structure itself onto the lining of the artery once it gets out there, because it's not as energized as it should be. So yeah, there's a certain subset of people that can do that, but most of us can't. We're not that. Right. We don't have those genetics, right? And we call those people freaks of nature. These people that can, these top athletes, that can do these types of things better than some of us. So yeah. So and then. The
So
last
sorry,
thing is the
just
zeta.
to follow up. So would that be like, there's a question in the chat, and if I didn't mention this, we've got a live audience here today. There's a question in the chat about HIIT training, like where you do something intense for a short period of time. Is that more in line with what our bodies are able to handle? And also, when you do hit the point where you can't do it anymore, what does that look like? Would it just be sort of like chronic fatigue or a heart attack, or are you just like, what does your body do to show you like no more?
Yeah, I mean, literally shut down. I mean, that's why we see people collapse at the end of marathons. Literally just can't do anymore because their tissues for so long haven't been able to get enough, nutrients because we've decreased that ability to structure the water and create the flow that's created by the tissue demand, right? So they literally wear themselves out, and that's a very inflammatory, very autonomic nervous system imbalancing type thing to do. Not that I'm saying that no one should ever do those things, because there's other reasons that people may want to do those things, like, emotional health maybe, or it's their job, like they make a lot of money doing that. But like for the average person, you don't need to do that type of exercise to be healthy, for sure. And that's my point, is with those types of things. And with HIIT training, it's more of a it's more of a tell your body you're not good enough for a short period of time so that it rebuilds stronger. It gets better. Like, okay, we didn't have enough healthy mitochondria to support that activity. Let's break down the old ones and build new ones and be healthy, right? Like that kind of thing. Our muscles weren't strong enough to do that. Let's change that, because that's just that. It sounds kind of negative, but you're telling your body it's not good enough so that it gets better, right? Yeah. But that's a short-term thing. You don't want to do that long-term, because I think the benefits wear out after a while, Right.
Yeah, because that's one thing that I've really learned that really shifted my mindset towards exercise since I've been studying quantum biology and working with people who understand this perspective on health, is that almost everyone I've interviewed who was like had a very intense athletic routine has chilled it out once they understand how their body really works. And they still do the intensity, but they do it much less frequently. Like they do it maybe twice a week instead of 5 times a week. And I've really learned the benefits of a restorative approach. And because it's so, along with the heart as a pump, like I think one of the things that's so deeply ingrained in us when it comes to exercise is like, you got to go hard, And I personally made the mistake of trying to do that when I was suffering from chronic fatigue, not understanding anything. And it obviously made it way, way worse. So what I'm hearing you say is that intensity is helpful, but you really need to moderate it.
Yeah, definitely. And you only need enough to tell your body to be stronger. I mean, just like even when I lift weights, like I'm doing one set to complete failure, and then I go on to the next exercise, because I don't need to tell my body anymore. It's hard to go to complete failure, and you have to do it safely, because you got weight. But that's all your body really needs. You don't need any more than that. So these short amounts of times. And so I don't like the term cardio, because I don't think that we need to strengthen our hearts to effectively create flow, because that's not how blood flow happens. So we don't need to strengthen, or don't need to train our hearts to be able to go for 15 miles. We need to train our bodies to optimize, I guess, nutrient and energy production, which is what those short bursts of things do. But it makes sense evolutionary to me, because if I was living in the wild, I think the only time I'd sprint for something is if I was going to eat, and so that's what you trained your body to do. So yeah. And then the last aspect, I think, of blood flow is the zeta potential, which is, water doesn't just structure itself onto the lining of an artery and other places throughout the body, but also onto the elements of the blood, especially red blood cells, but also lipoproteins, which is a topic I like to talk about with cholesterol and things. But that keeps things kind of evenly spaced, but still attracted to each other. Creates this electrostatic potential, where like it's almost like a situation where like charges are attracted, because they're attracted to the the opposite charge in between them. But then they get too close, they kind of move away from each other, so they kind of keep this good spacing between them, which is really important for the health and nutrient delivery and things like that of blood. But it also keeps things linked up together and moving. So you can think about it like train cars. When they're linked together and you create momentum with the engine, if you just cut the engine, it's going to keep going for a long time because they're all linked together and that momentum keeps things going. So when they're all linked together like that, it's kind of this cohesiveness, which is trigger word there, cohesive, but like it keeps everything moving together, so that momentum keeps it going in the right direction and flowing efficiently. All this kind of stuff keeps blood moving, and flow is probably the number one thing I think for health. It's keeping, not just flow of fluid in the body, but also flow of electrons, flow of like body movement kind of flow, but things like that. The flow is really, really important. And lots of issues that happen cardiovascularly happen when we get lack of flow. And so if we don't even understand, like from Western medical perspective, how flow actually happens, that's why they're having such a trouble treating these issues in flow, which is, plaque buildup, clotting, different things like that.
Right. Okay. So if we are now looking at the heart from a very different paradigm from sort of the traditional view that we would get if we went to a regular cardiologist, and we're looking at it in terms of flow of blood, flow of electrons, water, light, magnetism. All of these are the key drivers of heart health, according to the quantum biologic perspective. So from a practical perspective, if the old paradigm was, don't eat bacon and go running every day to have a healthy heart, and we now know that the idea behind the cardio all the time was to strengthen the muscle, but the muscle is actually not the key driver, it's the flow. So if we're looking at it from this paradigm, what would be the new sort of practical suggestions for people to keep their heart health optimized?
Yeah. Well, I'll take it back a step first and then go into those practical applications. But like,
okay.
So the old paradigm is like you said, don't eat bacon and do cardio, that kind of thing. And the reason that they say don't eat bacon is because of cholesterol, right? And cholesterol and saturated fat have been blamed for heart disease. And I like to talk about how, cholesterol is not the cause of heart disease. There's no one's really identified that some mechanism where elevated levels of cholesterol just evilly say, oh, I'm going to go damage the lining of the artery and do that. And if you look at it from a quantum perspective, there's zeta potential, there's this protective barrier of fourth phase water on the lining of the arteries. And if those things are intact, cholesterol is never going to get into the lining of the artery. But it doesn't do that anyways. It's clotting tissue, which is stagnant flow, which leads to inflammation and things just hanging out too long in an area that when they do that, clotting tends to happen more. And that's what atherosclerosis is. It's clotting tissue. There's very little cholesterol present when you analyze atherosclerosis. It's just like if you cut your skin and the scab forms, like it's kind of that similar type tissue, trying to stop inflammation and things from happening. And so then if we look at it from that perspective, instead of, over analyzing lipids, which, like the keto community and the carnivore community are very much into lipids, and they want to analyze lipids to decide whether or not they're good or bad for us. But when you look at it from a quantum perspective, it's just like, it doesn't even matter. Stop analyzing lipids, because you're just, Einstein, like it takes a new level of thinking, right? You can't solve a problem with the same level of thinking. So like, if we think that cholesterol is the problem because of this, we can't prove that it's not the problem by looking at cholesterol again. They want to analyze the small dense particles and the oxidized LDL and all that stuff. And that's fine. We can gain some insight from that. But when we look at it from a quantum perspective, it's way more important to increase flow, increase, the ability of fourth phase water to structure itself onto biological surfaces, whether it's the lining of the artery or the elements of the blood. makes way more sense to focus on electron flow to keep your mitochondria functional in your heart, because that's what creates that huge magnetic field, so the blood can continue to flow. And so that becomes the recipe for heart health, is optimizing your physiology based on this biophysics, rather than over analyzing this one aspect of the body, this biochemical type thing, this lipoprotein situation. And I say overanalyzing because it's all they talk about, and they argue about it all the time. And so, yeah, then the take home becomes, how do we increase flow? Like, how do we do that? And so that is getting energy from places other than food, getting energy in the form of infrared light, which is, one of the best ways to energize water so that it does do these things when it gets next to these biological surfaces. So, especially the sunrise and sunsets where we're getting more infrared, but just sunlight throughout the day, soaking up electrons from the earth so that you're not so dependent on food, but also contacting the Earth's magnetic field, which is most compatible with ours. Like, all these things are what's driving all this flow, and they show it too. Like, there's studies on grounding that show that it increases zeta potential dramatically. So it leads to that proper spacing. And so, because if the zeta potential is gone and we get that rouleau formation with these stacked coin-like red blood cells on each other, you can imagine that would interfere with flow, something that's individual and able to kind of, mold around the turns in the arteries and things like that, versus some long chain that's like of red blood cells. It's not going to fit through things as well. And it's going to create issues where things don't flow as well. And that can lead to clotting, which is why rouleau formation is a sign of inflammation and potentially clotting. So yeah, it becomes about those aspects of putting your body back in an environment that creates flow, proper flow, rather than biochemistry or whatever. But it's that way because we all know Western medicine has a drug for the biochemistry, so that's what it's focused on, because it's a system that it's a capitalist system that wants to make money just like anything else. But when you look at it from a quantum perspective, it makes all that irrelevant.
Right. And from a quantum perspective, the practical strategies do not require a prescription. It's like walking around on the earth barefoot for a few minutes, spending time outside, ideally doing your exercise outside, eating the bacon.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not.
Yeah, I didn't mention that. The DHA, from the animal fats, primarily seafood, but even from healthy land animals, I should say. Getting that DHA is what allows you to use the light to create electrons, to create healthy mitochondria in the heart that creates the magnetism that creates the flow. Like, it's just like this big kind of chain of things that we have to connect together to see how that works. And in that paradigm where it's like, exercise so your heart's good at pumping blood, that doesn't make sense, and it may actually interfere with that. And then don't eat the saturated fat, don't eat the DHA, which is again not allowing for other ways of flow, and it's totally backwards, and it's why it's not working. It's why heart disease rates continue to rise despite the latest procedures and the latest drugs and all these different times, because it's totally backwards.
Right. And we're narrowing down on one tiny variable, which is like, take this drug, whereas what you're explaining is an entire system, like where we put our bodies in the world versus just one exogenous pill.
Yeah. I remember I worked at a chiropractic clinic more or less across the street from a medical school and a research institute. And I had a lot of PhD patients coming in, and I would always ask them, like, what are you studying? And it was always like, well, I'm looking at this one biochemical pathway, trying to change this or change that so that we can make a drug for it and we can change that biochemical pathway. And so that's a very linear way of looking at things. Like, it's just like, this step leads to this step leads to this step, when in reality, there's this coherence where the body is communicating in a million different ways, which is why it's hard to even define like time in that sense, because time, we look at it as this thing moving from like one from the other, when in reality there's multiple things happening all at the same time. It's the same kind of thing with the body. Like, it's all happening all at the same time And so it just doesn't work, and so that's what's hard to grasp, because even in chiropractic school and biochemistry, I mean, that's what I'm learning. I'm learning these stepwise reactions. You think that's how it works, and but you can't change one little reaction without having an effect on the entire system or interfering with the coherence of the entire system. And so that's why I like to look at it that way, because we're a very complex biological ecosystem, and to think that we can understand it from one aspect of the body at one snapshot in time. I tell that people all the time, like that blood work that you're freaking out about is one snapshot in time for one tissue in the body. And you're looking at one aspect of that tissue in the body. Like, that's completely short-sighted, to think that you have any understanding of what's actually going on in your body from moment to moment, and I like that argument because people are so focused on LDL or whatever. But we have to back up and realize that you just have to kind of put your body in the right environment based on physiology, based on, physics really, and trust that it's going to do the right thing. Because if you keep trying to overanalyze this and then manipulate that one thing, then that's just not a path to health. It's just, it's so short-sighted. It doesn't even make sense. And people, once they get that, they're just like, oh, I kind of understand. And they stop freaking out. They're like, they kind of put the blood work down. I see it all the time on my consults. They put the blood work down over here and they say, okay, so what do I do? And it's a super useful, thing to get them to be aware of and see.
Yes. And that is, again, another gift, I think, of this approach, right? Is it brings such a sense of relief. I think, especially when we're dealing with chronic illness, which so many people are, it becomes like very onerous to track health. And then you hear a podcast and someone says this and about this supplement, and you hear this about that. And it's like a continuous kind of chase. Whereas the quantum biologic perspective is so holistic and simple that I really do see it, as you just described with your patients, like bringing this sense of like relief. And then I think once you get into it, even enjoyment of a path to health, right? Like it can be even fun. So I'm really curious. I want to sort of shift gears a little bit into the kind of mindset that is required to wrap our heads around something like this. Like when you were describing the vascular system from the traditional way, you said something like, like the physics of it just didn't add up. So when I was first trying to understand this paradigm, and I look at things very conceptually, I'm not like a detailed science person. So I was trying to understand, like, how did this paradigm come to be and why is everyone ignoring it in the traditional world? So I came across the work of Thomas Kuhn, who talks about, the structure of scientific revolution is his book, right? And he talks about a paradigm shift happens when the current framework, so many anomalies build up that don't fit inside the current framework of understanding, that at a certain point, you can't ignore them anymore. So what all of this evidence that you're seeing about how the heart works as a flow and not as a pump, there's like a little piece here and a little piece there. And at a certain point, there are so many anomalies that don't fit the accepted framework that you do become open enough to reach for a new one. So I'm curious for you personally, how you became someone who is able to do that, because it can feel very risky. I'm not even a practitioner. I was just shifting my own personal belief, and it felt a little risky to align myself with something that most people in the world are like, what are you talking about? You're wrong and crazy, right? So could you talk about the intellectual curiosity and the emotional resilience that sort of built up in you over the course of your life to allow you to be someone who's able to do this?
Yeah. And, I don't even know exactly of like a certain point in time where I felt like I had this epiphany or something like that. It's just, I've always been very curious. And I think my dad gave me that curiosity. My dad's always very scientific and just always wanted me to ask questions, even like we're doing science projects in elementary school, like I would do enough to get the project done and do it. And Dad was like, what about this? What about that? And I'm just like, Dad, I'm done with the project. And he was always just like asking me questions, like, I wonder why that is. So he taught me to be that way. And then it was my own, personal health journey of that. I just, at some point, I guess I just found it interesting that I was able to trial and error pretty much to control aspects of my health that, I was never told by a doctor that I could do. And so, because I had a really good relationship with my pediatric endocrinologist because I had to go to him every 3 to 6 months or so as a type 1 diabetic. And he was really a great guy, and he helped me understand more or less his understanding of what was going on in my body. But he never told me a lot of the things that I found out later on. He never told me that if I could change my diet, I had to give myself less insulin and things like that. So I just found it interesting. And so I'd always wanted to be like a medical doctor. But then I thought to myself, like, well, I'm learning all this stuff that he didn't even know. Maybe I don't want to be a medical doctor. And I was like, it's kind of hard schooling to be medical. I don't want to do that. But, I decided to go into chiropractic, but it just gave me this, I guess, no preconceived notions about anything. There was no like this, because you kind of grow up, or I grew up thinking, oh, the doctors know everything. And then you think, well, if they don't, then who does? It's like, well, nobody knows everything. But it kind of, like, what else is out there? It gave me that question, like, what else is out there? So then I just started reading, and it turned out I like to read, which I didn't know. But I've never stopped reading. And it just, and reading things in the context of, with no preconceived notions, like there is no way that things are. So that just allowed me to entertain all the different ideas, all the crazy different ideas that are out there. I didn't care what it was, how crazy it sounded. I just wanted to read it, because even if it made no sense, or I was like, that can't be true, I'd read something 5 years later that'd be like, that was true,
Right.
And so it's just always this kind of compound thing. And I'm only 36 years old. So I feel like there's a lot more learning to be done. I can only read so much at 36, but yeah, it was just, I guess I didn't feel like what I was being told by adults or people older, supposedly wiser than me, was matching up with what I was seeing in my life. And that happened very early on, which I'm glad that it did, because for lots of people it doesn't. And so once you have that I guess, doubt in, the authority or whatever, what's supposed to be the authority, even if it wasn't like authority like government, whatever, it was just the authority of, someone older than me. They're supposed to be smarter and wiser. Like once you figure that out, then you just realize, well, maybe they're not, maybe that's not the answer. So I'm going to go look for the answer. And fortunate for me, I had, the means to go looking for the answer. I had the resources available to me and always have, which, some people don't, but so I'm grateful for that. And now it's just, I'm learning more and more each every day. Like, even like the stuff that you guys call quantum, I didn't even know that was called quantum. I was just like, this is this cool stuff that I'm learning about, I didn't, and whatever, until like maybe a couple of years ago, I'd never really kind of applied it in that way or heard it in that term. So yeah, I don't know. There was no like one point or anything. It was just kind of, I don't know how my life kind of turned out, and the curiosity that I would think was instilled in me in a very young age.
Yeah. Well, that was a real gift because,
Incredible gift.
Yeah, I think too, just about, you're talking about people sort of doubling down on the analysis of one's very specific thing. And it's like, I find in health journeys, I see people find something that really helps them, whether it's a diet or a modality or something, and they sort of lock onto it as the answer, maybe form a bit of an identity around it. And then it's like just doubling down and doubling down and doubling down, versus what I see in your journey. And I'm starting to see also in like a lot of other people, different influencers like Sarah Kleiner, where it's like, okay, this was really helpful and got me so far, but what's next, like what else is out there, and opening up to the next step, as opposed to just sort of drilling down and down and down on the same thing.
For sure. I see it all the time, and it's a huge problem. I mean, influencers and things like they're incredibly useful for gathering information from, but yes, they do. And this is, I think, it suffers from the same kind of paradigm that's happening within Western medicine. Is you find some kind of solution, and that solution helped you or worked for a certain amount of people, and then your business, your livelihood becomes reliant on that solution or that idea. And so then it's very hard, especially if it becomes lucrative for you, to go away from that idea. And some of them do, and I'm proud of them for that. And I think that that's a good move for them. They go away from it or whatever. But lots of them don't. And then it becomes, you get the vegan influencers, you get the carnivore influencers that stick to these dogmas. And then people who, are just trying to get healthy get really confused, because this person's saying that, this person's saying this, and it's just really, really hard for them to determine, what's going on. And what they don't realize is that it's the same kind of thing happening within Western medicine. It's just like, oh, the pills are the answer because that's how we make our money. Carnivore diet is the answer. That's how we make our money. Vegan diet is the answer. That's how we make our money. It's really gets sucked in. And so, yeah, I've tried to not be dogmatic about things, and not by some wisdom of my own or anything like that, just because I've been curious. It's like, oh, yeah, well, this whole different set of things says something different. I'm going to go explore this and see how it fits in with this or that, or makes this relevant or makes this more relevant, whatever. Just because of curiosity, not because of, wanting financial gain or attention or whatever,
Yes. And at a certain point, dogma ceases to be effective.
Mm-hmm.
That's what makes it dogma. Like even if the dogma is sunrise, like it could be anything, even though obviously being out in the sunrise is hugely beneficial. If we get dogmatic about things, it kind of slows down the progress. And so that brings me to something that you and Sarah Klein are actually chatting about on her podcast, Evolving Wellness. And that is the ability for us as individuals to sort of connect to our experienced reality that we're experiencing through our senses versus, as you were saying before, like what the number on a lab says or what a certain dogma is telling us. Could you talk about how, and then I'm going to go to questions from our audience. Could you talk about how you see that in terms of a day-to-day practice and a different sort of way of thinking about our health?
Mm-hmm. So we can talk about like the biophysics and the biochemistry and all that stuff, and it's all super fun. But there's this aspect of, I don't even know necessarily how to say it, but like, I guess your emotional state, your experience, your relationship with your surrounding environment, at a spiritual level, maybe, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So, and how that in turn drives the biochemistry or the biophysics or the whatever. So it's just a huge aspect of health and life, I guess, that it's kind of hard to think about sometimes, because it makes people, have to focus on parts of their life maybe they don't want to focus on, which is hard to do. It's hard to confront those things sometimes. But yeah, so, we have senses, and we say we have 5 senses, but there's more than that. It's sensing our environment. Is this a safe or threatening environment? And that's pretty much, I think, what it kind of boils down to. It's why spirituality, I think, was invented. It was helping us deal with this world that we can't comprehend. It gave us reasons why the sun rises. It gave us reasons why thunderstorms happen. Like that was like the old lore, I guess. People had to come up with this spirituality to put their mind at ease about those things they couldn't explain, and it's the same today. I feel like people use spirituality to help them deal with the things that they can't find a reason for, why they happened in their life or something like that, or give them perspective on things. But anyways, the reason I came to this is because I was so interested in the heart. And I think the heart is what is interpreting our emotional state, and telling our brain what emotional state we're in. That's why we say things like, I love you with all my heart, and I gave it all my heart. We don't say I love you with all my kidney or whatever, even though maybe the kidney detects some of that stuff too, but the heart seems to have this emotional connection for us. It seems when our emotional state is incoherent, the heart seems to be what suffers the most, as far as function, whether that be metabolic changes, whether it be, the decreased magnetism of the heart, the electromagnetism that really influences the entire coherence of the body, because the heart has that big electric field and big magnetic field. It's one of the, I believe, I may be wrong on this, but I think it's the only organ that affects every other cell, at a quantum level in the body, because of how big that field is. And so our emotional state is incredibly important for creating this coherence, and so that the entire system can function as a whole. It's kind of like, I guess it's like kind of that steady beat, that is keeping the system going forward. However, a healthy heart is not quite a steady beat. It's this variability. And people ask me that all the time. They're just like, oh, my heart rate is this. And I was like, well, your heart rate variability is supposed to be not steady. And they're just like, what do you mean? Like, doesn't that mean it's chaotic? And then it's like, no, it's actually measuring your ability to handle stresses. Like if it's just, steady state all the time, then you're stuck in this one mode and you can't really adapt to other modes. And that's not how life works. Life is up and down all the time. So the variability in your heartbeat is what shows the health of your stress response, and how healthily you can get from, a non-stress state to a stress state and back to a non-stress state. Can you handle that? Because health to me is the ability to adapt to different situations, whether that's adapting to a different fuel source like carbs versus fats, or whether it's adapting to a stress response, whether it's adapting to different brain waves. Like, you've got to be able to go back and forth easily to different states. That's what health is. And so the emotional aspect of that is measured by no coincidence, I think, through heart rate variability. Measured through the heart. And so, we have to pay attention to this aspect. And people say it has mental health and everything. And that's the big part of it. But it's unresolved past traumas. It's all these different things that can influence our emotional state, which interfere with the coherence. And I've struggled with this personally, trying to increase my heart rate variability and trying everything that I can to do it, and nothing's working. And so I had to find some different ways, some ways that, I would never thought that it would do that, and things that can affect that. And so, but it's just amazing when you look at all the different aspects of your physiology and the signals your body's getting that can either increase or decrease coherence of this heart rate variability, of the signals your heart is sending to the rest of the body. Because it's not just, it's why I like, the quantum aspect of things, is because your mind can tell you a lot of things, like if I'm walking down the street and I hear a car horn, my mind's like, that's not a threat, right? But your body, that's not a natural sound. And so it has a stressful response to it. It's the same as not knowing when the sun rises and sunsets every day, or not knowing where you are on the planet. Like, if you ever woken up and you didn't know where you are for a second, you're stressed out, right? Like, you don't know if it's Thursday or Friday, you don't know what season it is, you just forget, and it's a stressful situation. Then after 10 seconds, your mind kind of, oh yeah, it's this day, it's this season, it's whatever, and I got to do this today. But your body, like your mind can think that, but your body needs those signals too, to know what time it is, what day it is, all those different things. Otherwise, it's very stressed. It doesn't know how to act. It doesn't know what signals to give the body. And that's reflected in our heart, because that affects the emotional state of being stressed or non-stressed. And so it's this incredibly dynamic, but also very influential aspect of physiology, is this psychology or the spirituality or whatever of the body and how it affects our physiology. And I'm still exploring it. But especially for the heart, I mean, I think it's the foundation of it. You can talk about all the other stuff as far as the exercise and what diet's best and all these different things. But like that I think without that, all the other things aren't as effective or aren't as important. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yes. No, and I think it makes perfect sense, because what we keep coming back to is a holistic approach. So yeah, we can talk about what type of exercise is good and what type of food to eat is good. But yes, if we don't have an emotional intelligence, if we don't have some mastery over our mind, if we don't sort of heal traumas that are sitting in the body, probably in the lattice work of that structured water somewhere, right? And anyone who's had a healing experience, I've personally had them, and I've had the privilege of being in the presence of other people, right? Like it's almost like a melting, right? And like a clearing happens. And there's like tears and like all of this emotion comes out. And then the feeling afterward is almost like you've had like an emotional shower or a spiritual shower there, you feel lighter and cleaner. And it's like that kind of, to me, cleansing experience is definitely strengthening the heart. Like I can't imagine how it isn't, in the same way that, detoxing other things that are clogging it up would.
Yeah. And you look at like Peter Levine's work and Stephen Porges and things like that, like these traumas get imprinted. People say stored, and I like the word stored, but I like imprinted too, because it depends on what you were doing at the time of that trauma. Like what part of your body were you moving? It may have got imprinted right there. And that's why some people have frozen shoulder and they can't figure out why. They didn't have an injury or anything like that. It's just something happened, but unfortunately, because the heart is processing a lot of our emotions and relaying out to the body, it ends up being a spot where traumas are stored or imprinted, because it's relaying the information. That's why there's things like Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, where people, like literally heartbroken syndrome, where you develop heart failure because you're heartbroken. It's a real thing. Even Western medicine agrees that it happens. So there's reasons for that. And so, yeah, it's in, finding someone that can help you release that trauma, because it's not just sitting there and talking to someone about it. I mean, that can help, and having support and things like that, but it's also processing where in the body it may have been imprinted and stored, and working that out.
Yes. So body work, sound healing, all of the things, therapy, everything. Again, back to the holistic.
Yeah, I think Peter Levine and his somatic experiencing has probably been the most impactful to me, just because it's a kind of approach that helps the therapist and the client identify where it's stored and allowing the body to process it. Because lots of times when you have a trauma, if you're not allowed to process it, it gets stored in the body, and somewhere, so that going into shock, that shaking or whatever, is the body processing it. And what does Western medicine do with shock? They try and suppress it and stop it, which ends up storing, the trauma, not allowing the body to get rid of it, which happens for a lot of people. Sometimes there is no shock response, but yeah.
Right. And so it's an ongoing journey there, and an evolving one. So I really appreciate you sharing yours. And then we're going to go into our practitioner community. We have people here today listening in live from the Quantum Biology Collective. So I just want to check in with their questions. And so Hannah asked, could you explain the mechanism of how endurance athletes may develop long-term cardiac sequelae, such as, what? I'm going to have you read that question. There's a lot of technical words in there I'm not interested in saying. Do you see it in the chat if you scroll up a little?
Oh, scroll up. Yeah.
It's from Hannah.
Oh. Yeah. So there is a thing as like enlargement of a heart in an endurance athlete, and they'll say things like, oh, it's because the heart's more effective at pumping blood. It's stronger, because it's having to do it more often. When in reality, I talk about studies in the book where it's actually the heart's more effective at stopping the flow of blood, because there's a certain point where, like, that's the other purpose of the heart, is that it's there to maintain balance between the arterial and venous sides. Because if I was to go for a run and there was so much tissue demand for oxygen that all the blood would flow over to the arterial side, and the venous side would collapse, and we would die, because then blood couldn't get back to the heart. But since the heart's there, it's maintaining the pressure between the two systems, so it slows the flow of blood during exertion, so that it can maintain adequate fluid pressure between the two systems. And so if there's a endurance athlete that has an enlarged heart, not like necessarily pathologically like heart failure, but just like enlarged muscle of the heart, it's actually more effective at stopping the flow of blood, because they're using it to do that all the time, because they're always exerting themselves. This study was done in soccer players. Most of the ones that I talk about in the book were done in soccer players. But then there's lots of evidence that endurance exercise will lead to increased scarring of the heart. And so scarring of the heart, like scar tissue formation in the heart, we can talk about what scar tissue does and how it interferes with communication, from a collagen perspective, but also it interferes with, how much of a contraction you can create that will vortex blood, that will, then once the blood goes out into the system, structure itself on lining of the artery and create flow. So that damage is what leads to the development of like heart failure. And it's why people, I've had multiple clients who had chemotherapy and ended up with heart tissue damage from chemotherapy, that are now having issues with heart failure. And so that damage can be caused by a lot of different things. And then like with AFib, AFib is something we can get predisposed to, maybe because our mother wasn't exposed to the right environment when we were in the womb, because flow is incredibly important for the proper development of the structure of the heart itself, but also the conduction system of the heart. And so if we're getting a poor conduction system like AFib, or an issue with the conduction system, then that could be something that we're predisposed to that happened in development. But it could also be an issue with autonomic nervous system dysfunction, like you're stuck in this stress state, and your body's thinking that it has to increase heart rate, or it has to, or it's confused about which signal to give to the heart, and so it's creating these fluctuations and the proper beating or contraction of the heart. So there's that. I mean, there's also evidence that magnesium deficiency, is effective for AFib, but that could be because it's just a muscle contraction issue, but also a nerve conduction issue. So yeah, I mean, as far as treatment for endurance athletes that may be struggling with these heart issues, it helps to understand what the function of the heart actually is, because if we understand that, then we can help them. So like patients I've had with like heart failure, whether that was from long-term endurance stuff or damage to the heart muscle, or heart attack, that damaged heart muscle, it's understanding that infrared light is probably the most useful thing they could do, because that's what's going to create the flow. And so that takes pressure off of the heart to contract and actually get blood moving out of it. It's playing to the strengths of the body, which is keeping blood flowing another way, like all these different aspects we talk about, the paramagnetism, the zeta potential, like, so with the grounding and everything, those things are what's going to help that person function optimally, as far as flow. And that's how we take pressure off the heart and stop stop these unfortunate things that have happened to them, this damage to the heart tissue or this improper development of the conduction system from affecting them as much as they should by putting the heart in an environment that allows it to function like it should be. So hopefully that answered the question.
Yes, indeed. So Amanda's asking about the differences between, if there are, between women's and men's heart function, especially because heart attacks can present differently in men and women.
I don't know about like specific function, like as far as like, contracting chambers of the heart or anything. I do know that there are differences seen, like, it's interesting that, heart attacks are more common, or at least they were for a long time more common in men until women get to a certain age, until we get like, you basically hit menopause. And, you can theorize as to why a lot of that stuff is. I don't know exactly, but one interesting idea is that, a menstrual cycle has actually been shown to increase parasympathetic activity. It helps create balance in the autonomic nervous system. And so it's almost as if that was this thing that was helping women out until they hit menopause, and then it stops and they don't get that anymore. And now the rates tend to go up potentially. But as far as heart attacks presenting differently, I don't know. I think, I don't know as far as like why they would present differently. I know that there's lots of different ways you can get a quote unquote heart attack. You can get a heart attack where there is an acute blockage, like mine was, where just an acute clot formed out of nowhere. I mean, there was no atherosclerosis really. It's just a clot formed. You could get a really severe imbalance in your emotional state, and then have an acute stress that drives this shift in metabolism in the heart, which creates issues with as far as flow of blood in and out of heart tissue, which leads to hypoxic tissue, which leads to death. You can get that, that gradual stenosis which in my opinion never causes a heart attack, but a break off of that gradual stenosis could potentially do that. Although there's evidence that even that doesn't happen very often. So it just depends. I mean, on what type of heart attack.
Sorry to interrupt. If that's not what's causing the heart attack, then what is?
What, the stenosis?
Yeah. If it's not the stenosis.
This kind of long explanation, but so there's plenty of evidence that. So if you look at Giorgio Beraldi's work, he did these plastic cast studies where he filled in the arterial system of the heart with a plastic, like a neoprene or latex solution, and then allowed it to harden. And then he dissolved away all the tissue around it with hydrochloric acid. And he was left with this perfect structure of the arterial system of the heart, which is kind of like what you see in like Body World exhibits and things like that. They do that with fish and things like that. He developed that technique. And he found that anywhere that there was a 70% or more stenosis, there was always a vast network of collaterals around it that fully bypassed the stenosis, and fully compensated the area with blood, 100% of cases. And so I've been told by cardiologists that some people have collaterals, some people don't, but Beraldi's research found that in all the hearts that he autopsied, like thousands throughout his career, that every single one exhibited this. So it's why we see that bypass surgeries don't prevent heart attacks, because the body already did it. It's why we see that elective stent procedures don't prevent heart attacks, because the body already created flow around it. We don't need to open up the artery. There's already enough flow. And they can form very fast, like within 4 days, some evidence shows. And
what's forming is like an alternative route for the flow to take if there's a problem with the main highway.
Yeah. Anywhere from, Beraldi said, like on average, 14 to 33 different vessels form around it.
So the body itself creates a compensating system. Right. And the main system is, for whatever reason, not functioning properly.
Right. And these collateral arteries are small enough that they don't really show up on an angiogram, What does show up is that if you have someone with 100% blockage or 90% blockage, you start putting the contrast up here, and the contrast shows up down here before it even gets to the blockage, because the collateral arteries bring it around.
Wow.
Right. So,
and then is the doctor or the technician going, oh my God, how are you even walking around? You have a 99% blockage, but it's because of this compensating artery
right,
system.
Exactly. I mean, there's evidence of people who go in and they have a heart cath and angiogram done, and they say, oh, you've got 80% blockage of this artery, you've got 90% blockage of this artery, and then the guy goes and runs a marathon. It's just, if you had 10% of your blood to a certain area of the heart, there's no way you're running a marathon unless you had some other way. But again, that's why the long-term research on heart bypasses don't show that they prevent heart attacks, because those stenosis are not causing heart attacks, and the body's already created a bypass. It's just that it's so small, you can't see it on the angiogram. All those little arteries, they don't show up. You can't really see the contrast coming through them. They're small, but there's just a lot of them. So the cardiologist, I'm looking at the angio, may not even see that. And unless you really slow down the angiogram, you're not going to see the contrast come from here to here. And even if you did, you'd be like, I don't know what that is. I mean, they know about collaterals. They're not stupid. Yeah. But some of them straight up tell me some people have them, some people don't. And I'm just like, well, explain these things then, So anyways, what does cause heart attacks is clotting. It's what happened to me. It's stagnant flow. And so stress significantly increases clotting factors in the blood. Literally, I think it's the number one, like acute stress. It's the number one thing that increases clotting factor. So if you're already in a state where you're inflamed and, you're whatever, you're not, there's no zeta potential, protecting things. You've got these low formations. You've got just poor flow because you've got lack of structured water lining the arteries. And then you go through an acute stress and increase the clotting factors, a clot can happen. And if the clot happens to be big enough that it blocks an artery right then and there before the body can break it down, because it will try and break it down, then yeah, you will get blockage. Now, the reason that it happens in the heart more often than other tissues, which it does happen in other tissues, you're going to get deep vein thrombosis, you can get kidney infarcts, you can get kind of stuff. The reason it happens in the heart more is because there's more pressure in those arteries, because not only are the arteries able to contract, but there's also a contracting and moving heart, which creates a lot of pressure. And the left anterior descending artery, which is where we see the vast majority, 95% of heart attacks, is under the artery under the most pressure in the entire body. And so when we get that situation where we have this increase in clotting tissue and there's all this pressure, that just increases the likelihood that a clot would form, just a random clot would form. That's what happened to me. I've been in a stressful situation for a long time. I'm predisposed as a type 1 diabetic, and then a very acute stress happened. And then 36 hours later, I had a heart attack while I was still dealing with that stress. That thing, because it wasn't just that it was a stressful thing, it was that the inability of my family and I to do anything about it for this person. And so I spent the 24 hours trying to figure out what I could do, and I couldn't mitigate the situation. And then I woke up Tuesday morning and had a heart attack. And there are other things I think involved too, like, I wasn't doing the sauna as much. I was consumed with work at this point, and I was somewhat socially isolated. I was oxalate dumping, I think, at the time. And then I had this stress. My body was pushing out oxalates because I had been on this very low oxalate diet for a long time. And it got to the point where it was pushing them out too aggressively. Kind of like if we mobilize heavy metals before we're excreting properly, or if our liver's not doing well and we try and mobilize heavy metals, that can be a problem. It can create a lot of inflammation and damage to the body. And so similar with oxalate dumping, you can try and push those things out too quick. And I think it was kind of this perfect storm that happened. And but it also said, hey, get yourself in check, like do the things that you should be doing and that kind of stuff. But yeah, so that's what causes the heart attack. So it could be either that acute clotting, and there's some evidence that if you do get atherosclerosis and you get this stenosis of an artery, that a piece of it can break off, and that can cause the body to form a clot right there really quickly. But there's also a lot of evidence that that happens all the time, and people don't have heart attacks when it happens. So, I am not convinced on that. I think heart attacks are more acute clots when they form big enough to block an artery, and then the imbalance in the autonomic nervous system where it forces, it forces metabolic changes in the heart tissue, forces it to burn more glucose than it wants to, which creates this buildup of lactic acid and hydrogen ions very acutely in a very short amount of time, which creates swelling in the heart tissue. And when there's swelling in the heart tissue, blood can't get to it anymore because the pressure is more coming out because of the swelling. And that creates this very stagnant, hypoxic area of heart tissue that dies. You get necrosis. I can't tell you how many people have approached me and said, I had a heart attack and there was no blockage anywhere. They couldn't find anything. And that's what's going on. It's a situation that we can get to that is triggered by an acute stress.
Okay. So it's like if
more common on Mondays.
Right. We're living our day-to-day lives sort of right at the line of what our body can handle with work stress, poor diet, poor light environment, all of these things layering on Wi-Fi, 5G, all the things layered on top of each other. So we're living right at the line of what our body can handle. And then you put a trigger on that and it crosses the line and our body can no longer handle it. And it manifests as a heart attack. Which is
why the emotional, spiritual heart rate variability aspect of everything is so important, because that's what mitigates. If that system is healthy, it's what allows us to get through that acute stress and that not happen. Right. Because it allows us to get through that stress, process it, and then the body returns to homeostasis, back to that, out of that stress response. Whereas if we stay in that stress response, and we can't get out of it because our body's just not trained well enough to turn on the parasympathetic and balance it out, then we stay stuck in that, and then we're just more likely to not be able to handle that acute stress. There's a reason, we have this, our vagus nerve is split. It's got two pathways, where in older evolved animals, it's one singular pathway, like reptiles. And there are some reptiles that are more highly evolved reptiles that have some semblance of a dual pathway, but that's because they were evolving slowly more to mammals, right? But in reptiles, they have a very slow metabolism. They're cold-blooded, right? So they can literally shut down organ systems and not die. They can play dead, so to speak. And for whatever reason, that was evolutionarily advantageous. And so you can get where I'm going with organ shutdown, right? So then in order to become mammals, for mammals to evolve, they had to evolve this system where you could have a stress response and not shut down organs. Mammals are warm-blooded, they're very active, they're very fast, they move really fast, create a lot more energy. And we needed a system that, because we couldn't afford to shut down an organ because we move so fast and we have this high metabolism. And so we needed a system, this dual system, that could allow us to have a stress response and also break it. Car brake, a brake, so that it wouldn't go into this full-blown organ shutdown or play dead shutdown, because that would be death for a mammal. And so that's why we've developed this two-phase vagus nerve, or the dorsal motor nucleus and the nucleus ambiguous. And if those two are operating functionally, then that's great. But I don't think evolution was accounting for the fact that we would store traumas and we would be under artificial light and we would be out of contact with the earth and we would have all these stressful things happening to us. Evolution couldn't account for this vast change, or this very quick change in way of life that has led to this imbalance in the autonomic nervous system. That is this stress state that can trigger these acute things.
Yes. And then we think, well, I don't know. I was just living my life, wasn't doing anything, not realizing that we've layered on all of these stressors that our systems don't know how to handle.
Yeah. Well, all that stuff is perceived as normal.
Just in our normal modern life. Yeah.
Yeah. All of it's perceived as normal. Like drinking Coke is normal, having LED lights is completely normal, that's just accepted, socially accepted, when in reality it's not normal. And it's only been very recently that those things have changed.
Yeah. And so we could add to our list of heart attack prevention. I know some people don't like the word meditation, but I got to it by someone called it, just learning how to trigger the relaxation response, right? Like just learning how to put ourselves into a state of relaxation on purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Stephen, thank you so much. This was incredible. I just want to end on one thing. There was a technical question about infrared light. You brought it up a bunch of times, but we didn't talk specifically about sources of infrared light. Could you just very quickly sort of give us a rundown on what that looks like?
Yeah. It's the natural, source of infrared light is the sun. What is that? 40 some percent of the light is infrared, especially, more infrared's coming at sunrise and sunset. So that would be the natural source, which is why we have a use for it, I would say. But, you're even getting some infrared, and just any type of sunlight. However, we have all these things that are counteracting that as far as, the bad electromagnetic fields, the bad light, different things that are interfering with infrared light's ability to structure water. So it's very useful to have more of a therapeutic dose of it, which is why I like infrared sauna. Sauna in general, just like steam saunas, are useful. Heating your body is useful, creating phase transitions and things like that. But infrared, I think it's better for detox. It's obviously having an effect on the water in our bodies, a big effect. So infrared sauna, I think is I don't understand why there's not an infrared sauna in every cardiac rehab center in the world, but there should be. But you guys got to make sure that your sauna is not giving you too much EMF, and that I like it. I want it to be the closest to the 3000 nanometer wavelength as possible, which some companies will tell you, some companies won't. The closest I found, and I haven't asked all of them by any means, is the one I use, the relaxed infrared sauna. So closest to that wavelength. Doesn't mean there aren't others that are maybe even closer or are pretty close to. But I like that one. And so infrared sauna, I think, is the main other source rather than natural light.
Right. So okay. So outside in the sun and infrared sauna a few times a week. Keep ourselves hydrated. Thank you so much. This was really spectacular and interesting, and appreciate you being here to share your
thanks for having me.
Wisdom and knowledge with us. Thanks, Stephen. This has been the Quantum Biology Collective podcast. To find a practitioner who practices from this point of view, visit our directory at quantumbiologycollective.org. If you are a practitioner, definitely take a look at the Applied Quantum Biology Certification, a 6-week study of the science of the new human health paradigm and its practical application with your patients and clients. We also love to feature graduates of the program on this very podcast. Until next time, the QBC.